In a kingdom ruled by holy light, a forgotten darkness begins to awaken. The truth hidden beneath the church may destroy the kingdom itself. The Veil of Astra.
Book 3. The Crimson Pursuers. Rain fell over Luminas once again, but this time the city no longer felt holy. The great cathedral towers still reached into the heavens like silver spears, and the bells of Astra still rang across the capital before dawn, unchanged from centuries past. The rituals continued, the prayers were still recited. On the surface, nothing had changed at all. Yet beneath those bells, something colder had begun spreading through the kingdom, something that no ceremony could silence and no sermon could explain away. Fear. Not the loud kind, spoken openly over drinks in taverns. The quiet kind. The kind that traveled in hushed voices behind closed doors and nervous glances over shoulders. Whispers of corruption spreading through the southern villages. Whispers of creatures emerging from the thornwood that no scholar could name. Whispers of dark magic, a phrase spoken so rarely and with such dread that most people instinctively lowered their voices before finishing it. And more quietly still, beneath all the rest, whispers of a silver-haired mage traveling beside the church's own blessed sister. Inside the sanctum of Astra, dozens of high-ranking priests had gathered beneath the soft gold of candlelight. Their expressions were tight, with a fear they were too proud to name openly. Holy emblems clinked softly against robes, as restless hands searched for something to hold. The grand chamber felt smaller than usual. No one wanted to speak first. Christopher Hale stood at the center of the room with his hands folded calmly behind his back. As always, his expression was composed, gentle even. The careful face of a man who had worn it so long it had almost become real. But his eyes told a different story. They burned with something that had no place in a holy sanctum. Not faith, not righteousness. Obsession. The Thornwood incident confirms it, one of the priests said at last, his voice only barely steady. The corruption is spreading farther south. Another priest leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice as though the room itself might be listening. Witnesses are claiming forbidden magic was involved. The chamber fell silent immediately. Several priests raised their hands to make holy signs, the instinctive reflex of men who had been taught to fear a word more than the thing it described. Dark magic was not merely forbidden, it was supposed to be gone. Erased from history so thoroughly that most scholars had begun to wonder, in their more private moments, whether it had ever truly existed at all. Christopher turned slowly toward the great stained glass window that overlooked the city below. Rain slid down the colored glass behind him, blurring the lights of Luminas into soft, bleeding rivers of gold and amber. Then we locate the source, he said calmly. He let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. But more importantly, we locate the girl. Several priests exchanged uncertain glances. One finally gathered the nerve to speak. You believe Sister Alexis is connected to this? Christopher's expression didn't change. The mage is dangerous, yes. He paused, his gaze still fixed on the rain-streaked glass. But the girl is essential. For just a moment, something dark moved behind his eyes, a flicker of something ancient and hungry that vanished before anyone could be sure they had seen it. His reflection smiled faintly in the glass. None of them understood what he truly meant by that word. Essential, and Christopher Hale intended to keep it that way. Far from Luminas, the caravan pressed on through the mountain roads heading north. Fog drifted between the ancient trees on either side of the narrow path, pale and thick, swallowing the sound of wagon wheels against stone. The world beyond the windows had become shapeless and gray. Inside the wagon, Alexis sat quietly near the rain-streaked glass with her knees drawn close. Her fingers moved without thinking, tightening and loosening around the silver pendant at her neck, a habit she hadn't noticed herself developing until it was already second nature. Something to hold on to when nothing else felt solid. She had barely spoken since Thornwood. Across from her sat Cyrus. The silver-haired mage was unusually still, his hands resting in his lap, his eyes fixed somewhere past the foggy tree line. The faint, purple aura that normally flickered at the edges of his presence had faded almost entirely, leaving him looking strangely ordinary, strangely human, more tired than she had ever seen him, not in the way of someone who needed sleep, but in the deeper way of someone carrying a weight they had stopped explaining to other people. Lena sat on the opposite bench, watching them both without saying a word. She was perceptive enough to know that silence was the only thing she could offer right now. The tension between Alexis and Cyrus wasn't the kind that a well-placed comment could soften. It was Alexis who finally broke it. "That magic you used," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Back in Thornwood." Cyrus closed his eyes briefly. "I know." She pressed forward because she had to. "The Church says dark magic destroys souls, that it corrupts everything it touches and leaves nothing behind worth saving." She swallowed. "Is that true?" Hale shifted in his seat nearby, the leather of his gear creaking softly in the quiet. Even he was staring at the floor. Rain tapped softly against the wooden roof overhead. The fog pressed closer against the windows. Finally, Cyrus answered. "The Church says many things." His voice was calm, careful, the voice of someone who had chosen every word far too deliberately for far too long. Alexis hated that answer. Part of her had desperately wanted him to deny it, to laugh, to tell her she had misread what she saw, to give her something to hold on to. But she couldn't stop replaying the moment in Thornwood with a clarity that sleep hadn't softened. The shadow creature had not simply reacted to his power. It had hesitated, pulled back, and for just one terrible second, it had looked almost obedient. She stared at the fog outside the window and said nothing more. But the question that had settled into the back of her mind refused to leave. If the Church had lied about dark magic, had buried it and erased it and called it impossible, then what else had they lied about? Several hours later, the caravan passed through the gates of Velrune. The mountain trade city rose against the cliffs like something built in deliberate defiance of the landscape. Massive stone walls carved directly into the rock face, warm orange lanterns burning along every street despite the storm still rolling overhead. Unlike the solemn grandeur of Luminas, Velrune was alive with noise and movement. Merchants called out from crowded stalls beneath hanging banners heavy with rain. Adventurers spilled from tavern doorways with drinks already in hand. Somewhere deeper in the city, a blacksmith's hammer rang out in a steady rhythm that cut through the storm like a drumbeat. And unlike the holy capital, the people of Velrune had no particular devotion to the Church. Here, faith was a private matter, or no matter at all. As the wagon rolled through the main thoroughfare, Alexis noticed the stairs before she could understand them. People along the road were stopping, not glancing up and moving on, but stopping entirely. Their eyes moved past Kale, past Lena, past her, and settled on Cyrus. More specifically, on the dark fabric of his cloak, where a silver crest was visible at the shoulder. A broken circular emblem engraved with ancient runes, not hidden exactly, but easy enough to overlook if you didn't know what you were looking for. Someone in Velrune clearly did. An elderly merchant near the edge of the road caught sight of the crest and went perfectly still, as though his body had received a warning his mind hadn't processed yet. The color drained from his face entirely. "Impossible," the old man breathed. Then he turned and disappeared back into the crowd before Alexis could react. She looked at Cyrus. He had seen it. His expression had shifted in a way that was almost too subtle to catch. A slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness that was different from his usual composure. For the first time since she had known him, she recognized what she was looking at. Not the controlled calm of someone who felt untouchable. The controlled calm of someone who had learned, over a very long time, to look unbothered when they weren't. He was afraid of being recognized, and he had been recognized. That night, the group took rooms above a tavern called the Hollow Lantern. Music drifted up through the floorboards from the crowded common room below, muffled and warm, almost entirely swallowed by the rain hammering the shuttered windows. Kale stood against the far wall with his arms folded, jaw set in the way it got when he'd already decided something and was choosing how to say it. "We have a problem." Lena nodded without hesitation. "We're being watched." Alexis looked between them, the unease in her chest sharpening into something more specific. "By who?" Neither of them answered immediately. The pause stretched just long enough to make her stomach drop. Cyrus moved to the window and looked out at the rain-slicked rooftops below. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and even, the way someone speaks when they've said a thing so many times that the fear of it has worn smooth. "The Crimson Order." The name settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Kale's expression darkened. Lena looked away. "You're certain?" Kale asked. "The crest I carry belongs to a lineage they've hunted for decades," Cyrus said. "Yes." Alexis had heard the name before, in passing, in the way certain names appear in holy sermons to represent something distant and already defeated. "But if they serve the church," she said slowly, "shouldn't they be protecting people?" Lena let out a short, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "They're executioners," Kale said, his voice flat and careful. "They don't distinguish between monsters and mages. Anything the church marks as forbidden, they remove. Mages, scholars, entire bloodlines if they have to." The room went quiet. Alexis turned the word over in her mind. Remove. She looked at Cyrus, at the silver crest, at the exhaustion sitting in the lines of his face, at all the things he had never explained, and she had never pushed hard enough to understand. And slowly, a realization settled over her that changed the shape of everything she thought she knew about him. He hadn't been hiding from monsters. He had been hiding from the church. Across Velrune, on the outer wall of the city, a woman stood alone in the storm. Her hair was a deep, vivid crimson, soaked at the edges, whipped back from her face by the wind. A black and red cloak shifted violently around her. She stood with perfect stillness despite all of it, as though the storm was simply weather and weather was simply irrelevant. Her sharp red eyes moved slowly across the glowing grid of lanterns below, reading the city the way a skilled hunter reads unfamiliar ground, looking not at what was there, but at what was wrong. Several armored knights knelt a few paces behind her, waiting. "We confirmed the reports," one of them said. "The silver-haired mage entered the city tonight." She did not turn around. Her hand rested lightly against the hilt of her sword, not gripping it, just touching it, the way someone touches a familiar thing to remind themselves it's still there. "And the girl, the church sister is traveling with him." She was quiet for a moment. Rain dripped steadily from the hem of her cloak, falling into the darkness below the wall. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was a precise and patient smile, the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time for something to finally begin moving. Lightning split the sky behind her, throwing her silhouette into sharp relief against the clouds. "The hunt begins tomorrow." Hundreds of miles to the south, deep beneath the Cathedral of Astra, Christopher Hale descended alone. Ancient stone stairs spiraled downward in a tight, lightless column beneath the cathedral foundations. There were no torches here. Christopher no longer needed them. He had walked these stairs enough times, in enough states of mind, to know them completely. Every uneven step, every place where the cold deepened, every point where the silence changed quality and became something heavier than silence. At the bottom, he entered a chamber that appeared in no record the church had ever kept. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling in carved symbols, dense, layered, overlapping. Not the clean geometric script of Astran holy writing. These were older, rougher in their form but sharper in their intent. The kind of markings that had been called forbidden, not because they were dangerous, but because they were true. At the center of the chamber, suspended in the air by thin chains of golden light, hung a black crystal roughly the size of a fist. Something moved inside it, a slow, rhythmic pulse, steady and patient, like breathing, like a heartbeat that belonged to something that did not need a body to survive. Christopher stood before it and said nothing for a long moment. His expression, so carefully composed in the presence of others, had slipped completely here. What remained was simpler and far more frightening. The face of a man who had given up everything, position, morality, perhaps even himself, for a thing he still could not hold. "So close," he said softly. He raised his hand. Purple corruption spread slowly across his fingers the moment they neared the crystal, threading between the joints, darkening the skin, before pulling back again, as it always did, retreating, refusing him. The crystal did not want to be controlled, not by him, not yet. "All these years," his voice barely rose above a whisper, "and still you refuse me." The crystal pulsed once, a single slow beat, a sound beneath sound, and in that moment, Christopher's reflection appeared on the dark surface of the crystal, distorted by the curve of the stone. The face looking back at him was his own, but older, the lines deeper, the eyes hollowed of anything soft, something close to inhuman looking out through a face that still remembered being a man. He smiled at it anyway, because obsession had long since replaced whatever fear he might once have felt about what he was becoming. Far to the north, in a small room above the hollow lantern, Alexis woke suddenly from sleep. She sat upright in the darkness, breathing sharp and uneven, her heart hammering against her ribs without any reason she could name. Rain tapped quietly against the shuttered window. The room was unfamiliar in the way all rented rooms were. The same shapes, slightly wrong. For several seconds, she sat perfectly still and tried to understand why she had woken. Then she noticed the light. Her right eye was glowing, a faint, deep red, the color of embers left burning long after the fire had gone out. Soft crimson light reflected across the walls and ceiling, casting the room in a color that had no business being there. Alexis pressed her hand over her eye with trembling fingers. The glow faded slowly, reluctantly, like something pulling back from a window it had been looking through. But the feeling didn't leave with it. The sense that something had reached toward her from a great distance, not physically, but deeper than that. The way a sound can reach something in you that your ears weren't meant to hear. She sat in the dark for a long time afterward, her hand still pressed to her face. Outside, the rain continued. The music from the common room below had gone quiet. Something had found her tonight. She didn't know what, she didn't know how. But for the first time in her life, Alexis found herself afraid of the answer.